23 minutes after I became a wife, my husband stood in front of 600 guests, took my adopted sister's hand, and introduced the twin babies he had secretly made with her. He did it beneath an arch of white orchids, while my wedding veil still touched the floor, while the photographer was still circling us, while my father's friends were still raising champagne glasses to a marriage that had already been poisoned before it began. Julian smiled when he said it. That is the part people never believe. He did not look ashamed. He did not tremble. He did not even lower his voice. He smiled like a man unveiling a charity initiative. This family has always believed in modern love, he said, looking out at the rows of bankers, board members, cousins, trustees, journalists, and people who had come mostly to witness the merger of two fortunes. And today, I want to honor the truth of that love. My adopted sister, Celeste Vale, stepped forward in a champagne silk dress that almost matched my own wedding gown. In her arms was one baby. A nanny appeared behind her with the other. Two infants with Julian's gray eyes and Celeste's dark curls. A sound went through the room. Not a gasp exactly. A collective intake of breath from people too wealthy to make noise, but too human not to react. Julian turned toward me then. My husband of 23 minutes. The man who had held my hands at the altar and promised fidelity. The man whose company needed my family's capital to survive. The man who believed I would accept humiliation if enough people were watching. He said, "Ava, I know this is unexpected, but these children are innocent. Celeste is family. We can build something bigger than old rules." Behind him, Celeste lowered her eyes at exactly the right angle. She had practiced it her whole life. Her whole life. The wounded angel. The abandoned girl. The fragile adopted sister everyone had to protect from consequences. My mother began crying before I did. That was how I knew the performance had been rehearsed. My father stood from the front row and said, "Ava, don't make a scene." 600 people turned to look at me. They expected the bride to break. They expected tears. A slap. A scream. Maybe fainting. Maybe forgiveness, if I could be pressured quickly enough. But they had brought the wrong woman to that altar. I lifted my veil. I looked at Julian. Then at Celeste. Then at my parents, who had spent 28 years teaching me that family reputation mattered more than female dignity. And I said, clearly enough for the first 3 rows and every microphone to hear, "You made one mistake." Julian's smile tightened. What mistake? I reached into the pocket sewn inside my wedding gown and pulled out a sealed legal notice. His face changed. Just for a second. But I saw it. I said, "You thought I came here as a bride. I came here as a CEO." My name is Ava Sterling. I was 34 years old when my wedding became the most expensive corporate trap my husband ever walked into. Before that day, the world knew me as the reserved eldest daughter of Sterling House, a private technology and hospitality infrastructure company built by my grandfather and modernized by me. Our systems powered smart hotels, luxury residences, energy optimization platforms, and secure building management networks across North America and Europe. People outside the company thought we sold convenience. I knew we sold control. Doors. Climate. Security. Inventory. Payments. Guest profiles. Energy usage. A building's nervous system. My father, Robert Sterling, still liked to introduce himself as the founder's son, though he had inherited more than he had built. My mother, Helena, believed a family's pain should be handled the way good silver was handled, polished in private and displayed only when it reflected well. And then there was Celeste. She came into our house when I was 9 and she was 7. Her mother had been my mother's college friend, a woman who died young and left behind a child with enormous eyes, perfect timing, and an instinct for weakness sharper than any adult around her wanted to admit. My parents called her a blessing. I wanted to call her my sister. For a while, I did. I shared my room, my books, my birthday parties, my mother's lap, my father's attention. At first, I thought love multiplied when it was shared. Then I learned that in our house, love was treated like inheritance. Someone always believed another person's portion had to be taken. Celeste was never loud in her cruelty. That would have been easier. She stole gently. She borrowed a necklace and cried when I asked for it back. She repeated something I told her in private and then looked shocked when I was hurt. She told my mother I had called her Charity, which I had not. She told my father she was afraid I hated her, and he began watching me as if I were capable of harming a wounded bird. By the time we were teenagers, Celeste had mastered the family script. Ava is strong. Celeste is sensitive. Ava can handle it. Celeste has already suffered enough. Those 4 sentences became the laws of my childhood. When Celeste ruined my Stanford scholarship interview by sending an anonymous note to the selection committee claiming I had plagiarized my application essay, my parents told me not to accuse her without proof. When proof arrived months later from a school IT administrator, my mother said reopening the issue would traumatize Celeste. When Celeste repeated one of my early business concepts to a family friend and received a summer placement from it, my father said I should be proud that my idea inspired her. I learned early that truth without power was just a diary entry. So I built power. Quietly, patiently, without asking anyone's permission. I studied systems engineering. I studied contracts. I studied capital structures and cybersecurity and the way charming men used language to hide desperation. While Celeste collected sympathy, I collected leverage. By 29, I controlled 42% of the voting shares of Sterling House through a trust my grandfather had created before his death. My father hated that. He called it premature concentration of control. My grandfather had called it insurance. I became Chief Strategy Officer first, then CEO when my father's expansion into lifestyle branding nearly cost us 2 hotel contracts and a European regulatory license. He moved into the role of Executive Chairman, a title with marble around it and less authority inside than he admitted. That was the year I met Julian Crest, heir to Crest Harrington Group, though heir was a generous word for a man standing on a balcony while the house behind him burned. His company owned boutique hotels, branded residences, and luxury retreats that photographed beautifully and bled money quietly. Julian was handsome in a way that made rooms forgive him before he apologized. Dark hair, gray eyes, a voice trained in boarding schools and investor dinners. He listened intensely, or at least looked as if he did. He made every woman feel like she had finally met a man who saw her strength and would not punish it. That was his gift? Not intelligence. Recognition. He could mirror ambition back at you until you mistook the reflection for partnership. The proposed merger between Sterling House and Crest Harrington made sense on paper if you ignored the smell of smoke under Crest Harrington's financials. Our smart infrastructure could stabilize their properties. Their hotel portfolio could expand our platform. Together, we would control technology and experience. That was the story presented to the press. The private story was simpler. Julian needed our capital. My father wanted old hospitality prestige. My mother wanted a wedding that restored her access to people who had stopped inviting her after my father's failed investments. Celeste wanted whatever I had. And I wanted to believe, just once, that someone could choose me without trying to consume me. I did not know when Julian and Celeste began sleeping together. Later, investigators would place the first confirmed weekend at my Hamptons house 14 months before the wedding. I was in Zurich negotiating a data privacy issue with a hotel group. Celeste had asked to use the house for what she called a restorative weekend. Julian told me he was in London. The house cameras had been disabled through a guest access protocol that should not have been available to either of them. That mattered later. At the time, it was just another strange technical note my security team flagged, and I put aside because love makes even careful women postpone certain conclusions. The pregnancy was not an accident. That was the first detail that turned betrayal into strategy. Celeste conceived the twins during the same month Julian began resisting the prenuptial agreement. My attorneys had requested full disclosure of Crest Harrington's debt exposure. Julian wanted the merger signed before disclosure. I refused. 3 weeks later, Celeste began appearing fragile at family dinners. She touched her stomach when she thought I was not looking. She avoided wine theatrically. My mother noticed. Then my father noticed. Then everyone noticed except, apparently, the woman whose fiancé was responsible. But I did notice. Strong women are often accused of being cold because we do not perform every emotion in real time. I noticed the dates. I noticed Julian's sudden insistence that family flexibility be written into certain trust discussions. I noticed Celeste asking my mother whether adopted children should have equal moral rights to inheritance, even when the legal documents were complicated. I noticed my father's new sympathy toward Crest Harrington's liquidity problems. I noticed my mother avoiding my eyes whenever Celeste entered a room. So I hired someone. His name was Marcus Vale, a private investigator with a retired detective's patience and a priest's ability to listen without blinking. I told him I did not want gossip. I wanted facts, dates, locations, records, photographs, metadata, things that could survive lawyers. He gave me more than I asked for. Photographs of Julian entering my Hamptons house with Celeste. Receipts from a medical clinic paid through a Crest Harrington subsidiary. Messages between Celeste and a lawyer about whether babies born before a merger announcement could complicate trust allocation. A hotel invoice under a false name. A voice recording from a restaurant where Julian said, "Once Ava signs the merger documents, she'll have to accept the children. She won't risk the optics." Optics. There it was again. The leash my family had used on me for years. When I heard that recording, I did not cry. That surprises people. But grief came later. In that moment, something much colder and cleaner arrived. Clarity. Julian and Celeste had built their plan around one belief: that I would rather be publicly humiliated than publicly difficult. They thought I would accept the twins, smile for the cameras, protect the merger, protect my parents, protect Celeste's victim story, protect Julian's access to Sterling capital. They thought strength meant endurance. They forgot strength can also mean refusal. My younger brother, Ethan Sterling, was the only person in my family I trusted completely. Not because he was innocent. No adult in a family like ours is innocent. But because Ethan loved systems more than appearances. He had built the original security architecture for Sterling House when he was 22 and bored with graduate school. He saw code the way some people hear music. When I showed him Marcus's report, he went very quiet. Then he said, "Do you want comfort or countermeasures?" That is why I loved him. He knew me. Countermeasures, I said. Within 2 weeks, Ethan found the second layer of Julian's plan. Crest Harrington was not merely broke. It was desperate. Their lenders were circling. 2 major properties were overvalued. One environmental report had been altered. A Cayman Bridge loan had terms so predatory that Julian had been hiding it from even his own board. And then came the real offense. Someone from Crest Harrington had attempted to access Sterling House's core hospitality automation algorithm. The one that coordinated occupancy prediction, energy load, dynamic staffing, and secure vendor routing. The system was our crown jewel. Julian did not just want my money. He wanted the engine. Ethan smiled when he found the intrusion attempt. Not because it was funny, because he had built for arrogance. He created a honeypot environment. A perfect false version of the algorithm. Elegant enough to tempt a thief. Useless enough to poison whoever tried to sell it. He embedded trace markers, jurisdictional flags, and automated logs that would capture every access point, every copied file, every external transfer. If he steals it, Ethan said, he'll carry our evidence for us. I should have canceled the wedding then. That is what a reasonable person might say. But canceling would have let them retreat into ambiguity. Celeste would have cried. Julian would have blamed my paranoia. My parents would have negotiated a private settlement to preserve the alliance. The board would have asked whether I had acted emotionally. No. They wanted a stage. I gave them one. On the morning of my wedding, I woke before dawn in the bridal suite of the Beaumont Hotel. The city was still gray. My dress hung from the wardrobe, white silk and restraint. My mother had chosen the veil. Celeste had chosen the flowers. Julian had chosen the date because it coincided with the pre-merger announcement window. I had chosen the pocket sewn inside the gown. Inside that pocket were 3 things. A legal notice of annulment based on fraud, a board resolution freezing all merger actions pending investigation, and a small flash drive containing copies of evidence already distributed to my attorneys, Ethan, and 2 independent directors. My mother came in while the makeup artist was working. She looked at me in the mirror and said, "Whatever happens today, Ava, remember that family dignity is bigger than personal discomfort." I met her eyes in the glass. Whose discomfort? She blinked. What? Mine, usually. She looked away. That told me everything. My father arrived 15 minutes later. He told me Julian was nervous. He told me men from great families sometimes made complicated mistakes. He told me Celeste was emotionally fragile. He told me the twins were innocent. He told me the merger could not survive scandal. I asked, "How long have you known?" He did not answer. Instead, he said, "You have always been the strong one." There it was. The family prayer. The sentence that had excused every theft of my dignity. I said, "Then you should not be surprised when I act like it." The ceremony itself was beautiful. That made it worse. white orchids, a string quartet, cameras hidden discreetly among flowers, a guest list that could move stock prices. Julian looked perfect. Celeste sat in the second row beside my parents, pale and glowing in the way women glow when they know they are holding a detonator. When Julian said his vows, his voice did not shake. "I promise to honor you with truth," he said. The minister smiled. Some guests dabbed their eyes. I thought of the honey pot logs quietly recording in a server room 3 miles away. I said my vows calmly. Not because I meant them. Because calm is not the absence of rage. Calm is rage that has chosen a schedule. 23 minutes after the rings, before the reception began, Julian asked for a microphone. My father did not look surprised. My mother gripped Celeste's hand. Celeste stood. The nanny appeared. The babies emerged. The trap closed. Julian told the room the truth he had edited to save himself. He said love was complicated. He said children were blessings. He said Celeste and I had always been sisters, and surely our hearts were large enough for an unconventional family. Then he turned to me and extended his hand. Like I was supposed to walk into my own humiliation because the aisle had already been decorated. I did not take his hand. I lifted my veil and pulled the legal notice from my pocket. Julian Crest, I said, this marriage is voidable on grounds of fraud, concealment, and material misrepresentation. A murmur moved through the room. Julian's smile cracked. Celeste's lower lip trembled. Professionally. My father stood. Ava, sit down. I looked at him. No. That word traveled farther than any scream could have. I continued. Effective immediately. All merger discussions between Sterling House and Crest Harrington Group are suspended pending forensic review. Any attempt to use today's ceremony to pressure Sterling House into accepting undisclosed liabilities, unauthorized dependents, altered trust claims, or intellectual property transfers will be treated as evidence. Julian stepped toward me. Ava, don't do this. I said, you did this. I documented it. Celeste began crying. My children are not evidence, she said. I looked at the babies. They were innocent. That was true. And because it was true, I refused to let their mother use them as shields for fraud. I said, no, they are children, which is why you should have protected them from becoming part of your scheme. The room went silent. Then Eleanor Crest rose from the groom's side. Julian's mother. Austere, silver-haired, terrifying in navy silk. She walked slowly toward the aisle. Julian whispered, Mother, sit down. She ignored him. She faced the room and said, Crest Harrington Group does not endorse fraud disguised as romance, Miss Sterling has my cooperation." That was when Julian understood he had lost more than a wife. He had lost the only respectable witness he thought he controlled. The hours after the wedding became legend in circles that pretend not to enjoy scandal. My attorneys served Julian before the cake was cut. Independent directors received the board resolution. Ethan locked the merger data room. Marcus Vale's report went to my legal team. Security escorted Julian's advisors out of the private finance suite. My parents followed me into a side room. My father's face was purple with humiliation. "You have destroyed us," he said. I removed my veil and placed it on a chair. "No, I stopped paying for the destruction." My mother cried, "Celeste has babies, Ava." I said, "Celeste has consequences." My father slammed his hand on the table. "You will not speak of your sister that way." I looked at him for a long moment. "Celeste is not my sister because you told me to absorb every wound she caused. Sisterhood is not a legal adoption paper. It is not a performance. It is not a weapon you hand someone so she can stab me more politely." My mother whispered, "You sound cruel." I said, "No, I sound finished." The next morning, Bianca would have gone to television if her name had been Bianca. But in my life, her name was Celeste, and she did exactly what Celeste always did. She became the victim before anyone could finish counting the bodies. She appeared on a morning show beside my parents, holding one twin while the other slept in a designer bassinet beside her chair. Her eyes were red. Her voice trembled. She told America that I had thrown 2 innocent babies into uncertainty because I could not handle sharing love. My mother sat beside her and said, "Ava has always struggled with softness." My father said, "We hope she remembers that family is more important than contracts." Contracts. The people living on my contracts suddenly hated contracts when those contracts protected me. Celeste released edited messages. In her version, I sounded cold, cruel, obsessed with money. She removed the parts where she had asked whether babies could create moral leverage in trust negotiations. She removed the part where she admitted Julian told her the wedding announcement would force Ava into grace. She removed the part where she laughed about my mother crying on cue. The internet did what the internet does. It chose a woman to hate by breakfast. Ice Queen heiress abandons infant twins. CEO bride rejects sister's babies. Sterling family wedding turns cruel. For 2 days, I said nothing. Not because I was afraid, because timing matters. If you answer a lie too quickly, people call it panic. If you answer it with evidence, at the exact moment the liar believes she is winning, people call it a reckoning. On the 3rd day, I held a press conference in the Sterling House auditorium. No flowers. No tears. No babies used as props. Just a podium, a screen, attorneys, independent directors, and Eleanor Crest seated in the front row. I wore black. Not mourning. Clarity. I began with one sentence. I will not allow children to be used as shields for adults who committed fraud. Then I showed the messages Celeste had released. Beside them, I showed the originals, line by line, deletion by deletion, manipulation by manipulation. The room changed as journalists realized they were not watching a wounded bride defend herself. They were watching a case being built in public. I showed the private investigator's timeline, the Hamptons weekends, the clinic payments, the false travel calendars, the trust discussions, the recording where Julian said I would not risk the optics. Then Ethan stepped up. My brother hated cameras, but he hated thieves more. He explained, in language simple enough for the press and sharp enough for the prosecutors, that Crest Harrington had attempted unauthorized access to Sterling House's core algorithm. He explained the honeypot. He explained the trace markers. He did not reveal the real architecture. He revealed the theft. Finally, Eleanor Crest stood. She did not look at the cameras. She looked at her son's empty chair in the front row. Then she said, Julian Crest has dishonored my family, his company, and the woman he married. I will cooperate fully with all investigations. By evening, the narrative had turned. Not softened. Turned? The same people who had called me cold began calling me strategic. The same commentators who had pitied Celeste began asking why a mother would place her children inside a corporate extortion plan. Celeste called me that night. I did not answer. She left a voicemail. At first, she cried. Then she hissed, "You think you've won. You think people will choose you over babies." I saved the voicemail. Some people speak most honestly when they think no one will use their words later. The FBI came for Julian 5 days after the wedding. Not at a dramatic gala. Not in front of cameras. In a private aviation lounge, where he was trying to board a charter flight to Montreal under the excuse of meeting lenders. The charges began with economic espionage and wire fraud. Then came extortion. Then conspiracy. Then obstruction. The list grew the way rot grows once the wall is opened. He called me from holding. I accepted because my attorney was present. His voice sounded smaller without tailored acoustics. "Ava, please, this has gone too far." I said, "It went too far when you brought babies to our wedding as leverage." "They're my children." "Then you should have been their father before you made them part of a negotiation." He said he loved me. That almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, Because men like Julian often call possession love when the door finally locks from the outside. I said, "You loved my signature. You loved my shares. You loved the idea of a woman strong enough to rescue you and trained enough to stay quiet about the cost." He was silent. Then he whispered, "Celeste said you would forgive it eventually." Of course she did. Celeste had survived on my forgiveness for 25 years. She had mistaken a childhood pattern for a lifelong permission slip. Celeste was arrested 9 days later at JFK. She had 2 passports, $80,000 in cashier's checks, a burner phone, and a laptop containing copied Sterling files she had no legal right to possess. She was not holding the twins. She had left them with a nanny and told the nanny she would return after a spa appointment. Greed has a way of revealing what people actually protect when running out of doors. Celeste protected cash. The children were placed in temporary protective care while the courts sorted through guardianship, paternity, and the criminal cases surrounding both parents. I did not celebrate that. Only monsters celebrate children suffering for adult evil. I established a sealed education trust for them through an independent guardian. No publicity. No tax advantage worth mentioning. No emotional announcement. Just a protected account no Sterling, Crest, or Celeste could touch. My attorney asked if I wanted anyone to know. I said no. Justice does not need to become branding. My parents were harder. Not legally. Emotionally. Julian and Celeste were enemies by then. My parents were the original wound. They came to my office 2 weeks after Celeste's arrest. My father had lost weight. My mother looked older in daylight without television makeup. They wanted access restored, funds released, a public statement saying the family was healing. My father said, "You cannot cut off your own parents." I looked at the man who had told me not to make a scene while my husband publicly offered me a life of arranged humiliation. "I can," I said. I had counsel draft it properly. My mother began crying. "Ava, we made mistakes." "No," I said. "You made choices. Mistakes are when you forget a name card. Choices are when you sit on television and help a liar dismantle your daughter." They lost their discretionary family support. They lost access to the Sterling Foundation accounts. They lost the townhouse maintained through company expense allocations. My father's honorary chairman role became exactly what it should always have been, a title with no checkbook. 6 months later, they moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Sarasota. My mother told friends they were simplifying. That was true, in the way a locked door simplifies a thief's options. I did not become soft after the victory. People kept waiting for softness. They wanted me to cry in an interview. They wanted me to say I still loved Celeste. They wanted me to regret humiliating Julian. They wanted a woman's strength to end in tenderness so they could stop being afraid of it. I did have tenderness, but I had learned to stop giving it to people who used it as an unlocked door. Sterling House survived. More than survived. Once the Crest merger was canceled, our stock dipped for 48 hours, then rose when the forensic report showed how much liability we had avoided. 3 hospitality groups that had hesitated before signed with us. Our cybersecurity division became a case study. Ethan became COO of Innovation, though he insisted the title sounded like something printed on a conference tote bag. I remained CEO, not because I had been betrayed, because I had been right. A year after the wedding, I gave a lecture at a private leadership forum. The topic was supposed to be corporate resilience. I changed it on stage. I said, "The world teaches women how to recognize predators at the gate. It does not teach us how to recognize parasites at the table. The people who do the worst damage are often not the ones who attack openly. They are the ones who move inside your language of love, family, loyalty, and forgiveness until their hunger sounds like your duty." The room went very still. I continued, "If someone requires your silence to preserve their image, that is not family. If someone uses children, illness, blood, adoption, marriage, or reputation to force you into accepting harm, that is not love. That is strategy, and strategy can be answered." Afterward, a woman in a gray suit approached me in the hallway. She was older than I was. Powerful, from the way people made room around her. She said, "I wish I had heard that 20 years ago." I said, "Me too." We stood there for a moment, 2 women measuring the cost of lessons that arrived late. Julian pleaded guilty to multiple counts. The final public list included fraud, attempted theft of trade secrets, conspiracy, and obstruction. His lawyers tried to present him as a romantic fool manipulated by Celeste. The prosecutors presented logs, emails, transfers, his own voice. Romance did not survive metadata. Celeste pleaded later. She held out longer because she always believed tears could negotiate with gravity. They could not. The court saw the edited messages, the extortion drafts, the stolen files, the attempt to flee, the evidence that she had planned the wedding reveal as a coercive event. During sentencing, she looked at me across the courtroom. For the first time in my life, her eyes were not soft. They were empty of performance. That was the closest thing to honesty she had ever given me. She said, "You always had everything." I almost answered. I almost said, "You had parents who chose your tears over my truth. You had my room, my ideas, my protection, my silence. You had every chance to be loved without stealing." But the judge was waiting. So I said only, "No, I had boundaries you mistook for walls you could climb. She cried then. Maybe for herself. Probably for herself. It did not matter. Punishment came for them in different languages. For Julian, prison meant the end of charm as currency. For Celeste, isolation meant the end of victimhood as shelter. For my parents, poverty of influence meant the end of reputation as protection. For me, justice meant the beginning of quiet. Quiet is underrated. After years of strategy, surveillance, legal filings, press rooms, board votes, and betrayal dressed in silk, quiet felt almost suspicious. I did not know what to do with evenings where no one needed me to absorb damage. I learned to eat dinner without checking crisis alerts every 3 minutes. I learned to sleep without replaying Celeste's face at the altar. I learned to walk through my Hamptons house again after replacing every access protocol Julian had touched. I learned that grief can coexist with relief without canceling either one. Sometimes I missed the idea of the family I thought I had. Not the real one. The imagined one. The one where Celeste had become my sister in truth. The one where my parents protected both daughters instead of sacrificing one to soothe the other. The one where Julian had admired my strength without plotting to consume it. Mourning an illusion is strange. You cannot bury it. You cannot show people photographs. You can only keep catching yourself reaching for a life that never actually existed. But illusions lose power when you stop feeding them. 2 years after the wedding, Sterling House launched an independent ethics architecture program for family-controlled companies. Ethan called it my expensive boundary project. He was not wrong. We built governance tools that made related party transactions visible, protected whistleblowers, logged internal access patterns, and required independent review when family members tried to mix affection with assets. At the launch, someone asked whether the product had been inspired by my personal history. I said, "Every useful system begins with a failure someone survived." That became the headline. For once, I did not mind. The first person to warn me about Julian was not a lawyer. It was not a board member. It was not even Ethan. It was a night security supervisor named Mrs. Alvarez, who had worked in our headquarters since before I was old enough to wear heels. 3 months before the wedding, she came to my office after midnight carrying a paper cup of coffee and the expression of a woman who had decided loyalty was more important than comfort. She said, "Miss Sterling, I do not like the way Mr. Crest looks at locked doors." That sentence stayed with me. Some people look at locked doors as boundaries. Others look at them as insults. Julian belonged to the second kind. Mrs. Alvarez had seen him linger near the restricted elevator twice. She had seen him speak too warmly to a junior systems analyst who should never have had access to merger sandbox credentials. She had seen Celeste arrive at the building one evening wearing sunglasses and leave with a document tube she had not entered with. None of it was enough by itself. That is how schemes survive. They break themselves into pieces so each piece can be explained away. A visit. A mistake. A coincidence. A sister borrowing something. A fiancé curious about your work. But I had spent my entire life watching Celeste turn small explanations into large permissions. So I thanked Mrs. Alvarez. I doubled her security budget. Then I asked Ethan to audit every soft access point attached to the merger. That was when we found Gerald Pike. Gerald was our COO, a man my father had protected for years because he played golf well and knew how to say yes to mediocre men in expensive rooms. Gerald had been quietly feeding Julian operational summaries that did not belong outside our walls. Not the deepest secrets. Not at first. Just enough to make Julian believe a larger theft was possible. When confronted privately, Gerald claimed he was facilitating integration. That was his phrase. Facilitating integration. People in companies commit treason every day and name it teamwork. I did not fire him then. I let him remain exactly where he was, surrounded by logs he did not know were awake. Ethan called it cruel. I called it patient. A thief caught with empty hands can still pretend he was only reaching for air. A thief caught carrying the safe has fewer poems available. During those months, Celeste grew bolder. She began touching my arm in front of people, asking if I was overwhelmed by the wedding, telling my mother that I looked tired, telling Julian in my hearing that I had always found intimacy difficult because control was easier for me than trust. I would smile. Not because it did not hurt, because I was studying her. Celeste's power had always depended on movement. She created emotional weather, then stood under an umbrella while everyone else got wet. At dinner, she would mention some childhood pain just as my mother was about to ask her a hard question. In family meetings, she would tear up just before someone needed to examine numbers. At charity events, she would tell strangers how grateful she was to have been rescued by us, turning my family into saints and herself into a sacred obligation. And behind all that softness was arithmetic. If she was helpless, she could demand protection. If she was wounded, she could demand resources. If she was family, she could demand access. If I objected, I became cruel. That was the machine. I did not build it. But I had spent my childhood powering it. The difference now was that I had stopped supplying electricity. 2 weeks before the wedding, Julian asked me to dinner at a private club overlooking the river. He arrived with a velvet box and the warm, practiced humility of a man about to request something ugly. Inside the box was a bracelet. Diamonds. Art Deco. Beautiful, in the way expensive apologies are beautiful before you know what they are apologizing for. He fastened it around my wrist and said, "I want us to begin this marriage without suspicion." I looked at the bracelet. How generous! He missed the edge in my voice. Men like Julian often hear tone only when it belongs to them. Then he slid an amendment across the table. Not the full prenuptial agreement. Just a small clarification, he said. A compassionate provision, he said. A recognition that family can take unexpected forms. The amendment would have created a discretionary support channel for minor dependents acknowledged within the marital family structure. It would have allowed funds to pass through a family office controlled jointly after the merger. It would have blurred legal responsibility, trust morality, and public expectation into a fog thick enough for Celeste to build a house inside it. I looked at Julian. He looked back as if he were offering mercy. I said, "No." His fingers tightened around the stem of his glass. Just slightly. There he was. The man beneath the charm. "Ava," he said softly, "you have to learn that not everything can be controlled by contracts." I folded the paper and placed it back in front of him. And you have to learn that people who say that usually want control without accountability. He smiled after a second. Too late. I had already seen the door open. That night, he went to Celeste. Marcus photographed him entering the service entrance of the apartment my parents had leased for her under a foundation wellness grant. Wellness grant? That was what my mother called paying rent for the woman sleeping with my fiancé. The final week before the wedding was not romantic. It was intelligence work in white satin. My florist asked about peonies while my attorneys reviewed annulment language. The pastry chef wanted final approval on the cake while Ethan monitored false credentials moving inside a controlled server environment. My mother cried over seating arrangements while I reviewed a subpoena strategy. There is a special kind of loneliness in knowing the truth before the room does. Everyone congratulates you. Everyone tells you how beautiful you look. Everyone says you must be so happy. And you stand there carrying evidence heavier than any bouquet. The only time I almost broke was not because of Julian. It was because of the twins. Marcus sent one photograph of them sleeping in bassinets at Celeste's apartment. They were tiny, unaware. Their fists curled near their faces. They had done nothing except be born into a plan built by greedy adults. I sat in my office staring at that photograph for a long time. Then I called my attorney and said, "If this becomes public, make sure someone independent protects the children's interests." She said, "That is not your responsibility." I said, "No, but it is within my power." There is a difference. The boardroom purge happened after the press conference but before Julian's arrest. That part never made the headlines as loudly as the wedding, but inside Sterling House, it mattered more. Gerald Pike walked into the emergency board meeting wearing the confidence of a man who had spent 20 years being protected by other men's comfort. He expected me to be distracted. He expected scandal to weaken me. He expected my father to speak first. Instead, I opened the meeting. I displayed the access logs. Then the email chain. Then the unauthorized summaries sent to Julian's personal account. Then the internal memo Gerald had drafted proposing a post-merger operations committee that would have transferred 3 key security decisions away from my office. Gerald said, "This is being taken out of context." I had heard that phrase so many times from guilty people that I almost admired its loyalty. I said, "Then provide the context." He looked at my father. My father looked at the table. For the first time in his life, Robert Sterling discovered that silence can be inherited backward. Gerald was removed by vote. My father's honorary authority was restricted to ceremonial appearances. Every family-related transaction entered review. Every merger channel closed. Every external credential reset. When the meeting ended, one of the older directors pulled me aside and said, "You handled that with remarkable restraint." I said, "No, I handled it with records." Restraint had been demanded of me all my life. Records were new. Records did not ask whether Celeste was crying. Records did not care whether Julian looked sincere. Records did not soften because my mother was embarrassed. Records held the shape of the truth when people tried to bend memory. That is why liars hate documentation. It refuses to be charmed. For months after the arrests, I received letters. Some were hateful. Some were strange. Some were from women who had never met me but recognized the architecture of what had been done. One woman wrote that her sister had used illness the way Celeste used adoption. Another wrote that her husband had called her cold for refusing to pay his gambling debts. Another wrote only one sentence: "I did not know I was allowed to say no to a family emergency that someone else created on purpose." I printed that one and kept it in my desk. Not because I needed praise. Because it reminded me that private resistance becomes public permission when someone survives loudly enough. That is the part my parents never understood. They thought public truth was humiliation. Sometimes it is. But sometimes public truth is a door opened for people still trapped in private rooms. People still ask whether I regret the wedding. They mean whether I regret letting it happen. Whether I regret not walking away quietly before the ceremony. Whether I regret making the punishment public. No. I regret every year I spent mistaking endurance for virtue. I regret every time I let Celeste's tears outrank my evidence. I regret every dinner where I allowed my father to call me difficult because difficult was easier than admitting I was right. But I do not regret the moment I stood in my wedding dress and refused the script. That moment saved my company. It saved my name. It saved the version of me that had been trained since childhood to carry other people's consequences like family heirlooms. The truth is, I did not become strong at the altar. I had been strong for years. Strong when I stayed silent to survive childhood. Strong when I built voting control while they called me cold. Strong when I smiled through rooms full of people who benefited from underestimating me. Strong when I gathered evidence instead of begging for honesty. The altar was not where my strength began. It was where everyone else finally had to see it. If you are listening to this and someone has convinced you that being strong means accepting more pain, I want you to hear me. Strength is not endless accommodation. Strength is not protecting the people who keep handing you knives and calling them family heirlooms. Strength is not staying quiet so liars can keep their lighting flattering. Sometimes strength is a sentence. No. Sometimes it is a folder. Sometimes it is a saved voicemail. Sometimes it is a board resolution hidden in the pocket of a wedding gown. Sometimes it is letting the whole room gasp because the truth finally arrived dressed better than the lie. Julian thought he could turn my wedding into my surrender. Celeste thought she could turn babies into leverage. My parents thought they could turn reputation into a cage. They were all wrong. My wedding did not make me a wife. It made me free.